Hi, guys. Welcome to the Philosopher podcast. I'm your host. My name is Jiggy Jr., and this episode is brought to you by Lala Move. That's right, Lala Move. Download the app now. Also, thank you so much to Living in Style at the Park Mall. I'm actually using this very comfortable chair, courtesy of our good friends from Living in Style. Also, thank you so much, Converge. That's Converge ICT FiberX. If you want pure end-to-end fiber internet, subscribe to Converge FiberX now. Ask me about how you can get a line in your neck of the woods. Also, we'd like to thank the Lemon Company. Thank you so much. Hi, guys. Welcome to the Philosopher podcast. I'm your host. My name is Jiggy Jr., and today we're going to talk about poetry and philosophy in a pandemic. And our very special guest for today is a co-professor at the USC Philosophy Department, Mr. Daryl Mendoza.
Hi, Gigi. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me again.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a long time. It's crazy how long ago it was. It was still a different universe when we first spoke, pre-pandemic, right?
Right. Several years ago. 2 years, 3 years ago.
Actually, longer than that because it was another universe.
Oh, wow.
It was a totally different and completely different universe. Now we're here in this situation that we have been in for the past, I don't know, 1.5 to almost 2 years now. Daryl, I wanted to talk to you about poetry, philosophy, and the pandemic because I feel that it is in times of crisis that we need to listen to voices of reason. And of course, one of the most reasonable voices and reliable voices that we listen to in times of medical crisis are usually the scientists, right? The medical professionals. At the same time, there are so many things that don't make sense, not even to science, not just during the pandemic, but just in crises, in life in general, when life in crisis in general, there's so many things that cannot be explained or cannot be brought to light when you just use science as the lens. So we need a philosophical perspective. That's why I wanted to talk to you because you're the only philosopher that I know. Maybe you should introduce me to your friends too, Daryl. So Daryl, my first question is, before we get into that, my first question is, what is the role of philosophy in society?
Well, first of all, Gigi, I'd like to think of myself as a teacher in philosophy more than a philosopher, right? Because most philosophers are dead. Oftentimes we call a philosopher somebody who's already dead and has left a legacy. But yeah, to your question, what is the role of philosophy to society? That's a very good question. Uh, I remember my teacher, she would always tell us that one of the most important roles of philosophy is to be the watchdog of society, right? Because in society, you have different interests. Okay? You have the interests, say, of the politicians. You have the interests, say, of the business people. You have the interests, say, of even the scientists, the doctors, etc., etc. So, and sometimes, particularly in a crisis, since we are talking about a crisis today, uh, these interests oftentimes go beyond reason, right? And one of the role of philosophy in society, I think, is to safeguard society from this uh, unreasonable interests. You know, when we have interests, it's if you compare it to a person, an interest is like a drive, our desire. Okay? We want to fulfill something. And oftentimes this desire is goes against reason, right? That's why there are so many things that we want to do, which is not very reasonable. Now we want, if you look at this in relation to society, you can look at these interests as like drives or desires. They can be for the good, but they can also be not very good. They can also be quite unreasonable. The philosopher, particularly, I think, is supposed to provide a critique. Okay, critique is very important in philosophy. To say, this is getting unreasonable, okay? Even getting exploitative, even getting oppressive. And so we have to check that. And our means for checking that is to use our reason. Okay? One philosopher would make a distinction. This is quite interesting, I think, particularly in our case today. One philosopher makes a distinction between what we call as a public sphere, the use of reason in the public sphere, and of the private sphere. For example, one way of looking at it is that our beliefs belong to the private sphere. One way of looking at it. I can practice my faith, say, within my private sphere, but it would be different if I start to impose that to the public. But there are groups who wants to impose their personal opinions, their personal beliefs to the public. So one function of the philosopher is precisely to tell us or to tell society that this is not reasonable. This is getting off hand. You cannot impose your personal beliefs and opinions to the public. So there are, in another way of saying, there are certain standards when we are in the public sphere. There are certain standards, reasonable standards, reasonableness. You cannot do things in the public sphere that are unreasonable. Okay? And again, the function of the philosopher is precisely to show what is unreasonable and what is not. And this is through what we in philosophy call as critique. So I think that's one of the many functions, if you ask me about philosophy in society, to serve as critique.
We have so many of these great philosophers like Descartes, Plato, and all of those big names. They arose at a certain time in history, right? Can you tell us time of when these philosophers, grew their prominence?
Right. There are several. For example, Socrates was a soldier in the, if I'm not mistaken, that was the Peloponnesian War. More importantly, for example, I think this is a more popular school in philosophy, if you call it a school, is what we call as existentialism. And the existentialists rose from the experience of two world wars, okay? The likes of Jean-Paul Sartre, even Albert Camus. Their experience was coming from the experience of two world wars. And this is why you see existentialism, which is oftentimes discussed already now in senior high philosophy. They talk about the meaning of life. They talk about the emphasis is on the meaning of life, the search for the purpose of life, etc. Another philosopher, for example, I am not sure if he's very popular to those outside philosophy, is the German philosopher Hegel, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And he was, the time where he wrote his work was during the Napoleonic Wars. Okay? So one of my professors would say, if you live in a boring time, most likely you will not end up an important philosopher. So these are many philosophers, different philosophers were born in rather interesting times.
So
those are some examples.
What was the period, sir, that philosophers were most prominent, that their role in society was most prominent? Can you take us back to that time when philosophers and scientists were of equal footing in terms of prominence?
Right. I can mention several. There are several registries there, right? If we're going to talk about prominence, I think the most famous, would be Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a philosopher. He did his PhD in philosophy. And when you talk about, for example, communism, although interestingly, Marx doesn't discuss communism in any of his works, we oftentimes connect it with Karl Marx. And when we talk about philosophy in terms of his relation to, or her relation to society, I would think Marx is one, if not the most prominent, most famous. He is oftentimes discussed in the social sciences and in other fields. But also you have to remember that during the modern period, by modern period, we are not referring to the 20th century. By modern period, in the standards of philosophy, modernity began around the 16th century. Okay, so when Magellan arrived here, it was Europe was already in modernity. Now you have to remember that before modernity, there was no strict distinction between science, philosophy, theology, and magic, even. Okay? They were all considered, science was really just understood as a systematic knowledge. Okay? So modern science, as we know it, was only born around modernity, around the 16th century, particularly with the development of the scientific method, particularly with the discoveries of Copernicus, the validations of Galileo. So before that, it was quite difficult to distinguish science and modern science as we know it from theology or from philosophy. They are all sciences. In fact, interestingly, the work of Newton is often considered as natural philosophy, and that's Newton, classical physics. So the distinctions are not quite clear before modernity. They are just different kinds of sciences. But if you compare it now, the distinction is that you have, theology, and you have the arts, and then you have the sciences. I think the culprit there, if we look at the history of thought, the culprit there is what we call as positivism, the rise of positivism, and the battle cry here is you have to quantify. If it cannot be quantified, if it does not pass through the experience, then it can, and if it cannot be verified, this is coming again from modernity's Bacon, for example, Francis Bacon, then it cannot be considered as scientific, right?
So there was no specific point in history that philosophers were most prominent. It seems to me, the way you described it, they all came from times of turbulence, right? You mentioned World War I, World War II, and all of those earth-shattering, earth-shaking moments in history. So that's when philosophers grow prominent. Is that a correct statement, sir?
I would like to think that in each age, in every history, there are philosophers. Only that the more important ones are highlighted. And oftentimes, and maybe this is merely coincidental, the more prominent ones, the context of their rise is also in relation to a rather interesting time, okay, in history.
Interesting time, meaning to say, these are the times that perhaps people needed their philosophers.
In a certain way, it's not so much, I think, that they needed the philosophies, rather that interesting times are, in times of crisis, you have philosophers or philosophies mature, thinking mature. And there's a rather interesting term here, Jigin. Maybe this is not very familiar to many. The term crisis is actually a Greek word. It's coming from a Greek word. And originally, its meaning is a decision. You have to make a decision. This is a term that was referred to in theology as a decision that has to be made in the last judgment. And this is also a term used in medical science to refer to a decision that a doctor has to make. That's life and death. That's the etymological or the origin of the word crisis or crisis. And so when I said interesting times and then say crisis, it's precise in our times. It's precisely because decisions have to be made. Important decisions have to be made. And so in those times, in those interesting times, thought matures because, and it's given a certain kind of prominence because whatever the decision, whatever thinking that happened during the time affects us today. And we look at it from hindsight. Like, for example, sorry.
Well, go ahead, continue.
Yeah, I was thinking, for example, because you talk about philosophy and society, I was thinking, for example, of Marx. Okay, and Marx was reacting during his time. That was during the industrial period, the industrialization of Europe during the time. In fact, if you're going to look at that rather interesting work by Victor Hugo, okay, there is Les Miserables. The very first part of Les Miserables describes the situation during the time. There was industrialization, and then there was massive urbanization. People from the countryside are going to the factories in the city, and it was a situation that was quite desperate and dire. Okay, and this is shown, I think, in Les Miserables, whether it's in the novel or in the adaptations. And Marx was coming from that situation, and when he talks about exploitation, he talks about alienation, etc. He provides an analysis of society. Okay? It was coming from that context. I'm mentioning Marx because he's the more famous one. But sadly, though, although Marx is quite famous, people quite quote him often. Just so, in my experience, people don't actually read him. That's why he oftentimes gets misinterpreted. Oftentimes,
I'm curious. Yeah. Maybe this has nothing to do with our conversation today, but I'm just curious. Because Karl Marx is also associated with communism, right? Is the doctrine of Karl Marx the same doctrine as what the Chinese government is sort of espousing, or is it just by coincidence that it looks like it's similar, if not the same as Karl Marx? Did they get it from Marx? Was this concept from Karl Marx, or was it from a totally different perspective?
Yeah, the tradition comes from Marx.
Okay,
but that's a very long history because there are different. So you have Karl Marx, and you have Engels, and then again there were the first international, the second international. The international here refers to the Working Men's Association. Long story short, it reached China, and the most prominent person there is Chairman Mao, right? But the China that we have now, I don't think it's the same as I've said, it has passed through several readings, have several, how do you put it, several adaptations, such that the China that we have now, which is communist in virtue because the dominant party is the Communist Party, but it's not really communists. That's my rather bold assertion. It's capitalist. It's a hybrid of a certain kind of socialism.
Social capitalism?
I wouldn't even know if you call it social capitalism, but it's definitely capitalism.
Okay.
There are so many billionaires in China. So I think there's a long story there. There's a long tradition of how it happened. Yeah. So.
We're sidetracked for a little bit. I'm just curious about that question. But my next question, sir, is this: I still seem to be getting my dose of smart people trying to make sense of it all. But I'm getting it from the comedy shows that I watch, the talk shows that I listen to, the songs that I listen to. I seem to still be getting some kind of philosophy somewhere, but I just don't get it from actual philosophers. Now, my question should probably be, what constitutes a philosopher? How do you become a philosopher? And our singers, our talk show hosts, our podcasters, our politicians, our religious leaders, some kind of philosophers. There are two questions there, sir.
Okay. Let me, that's a difficult question, but let me try to answer it in a straightforward way. So we can look at perhaps that question, we can answer that question perhaps with two qualifications. We can say a philosopher is someone who is paid to do philosophy. Okay, that's the. So, for example, if you have a university professor or you have a professor doing philosophy, getting paid to teach philosophy, getting paid to research on philosophy, then in that sense, you can say that's a professional philosopher. So, okay. in the clearest sense, I guess. But if you talk about philosophy as a kind of in the likes of, say, Socrates or in the likes of Descartes, I think, and this is what I said earlier, I think it's most it's something given to you when you're dead. So when you have written a work that or you have left a legacy that is so important, original, but at the same time is standing on the shoulder of giants, then I think only then can you become a philosopher. But there's a further qualifications there. A philosopher is different from an entertainer. A philosopher is different from a scientist, because we oftentimes have this thinking that philosophy talks about everything. That's partly right. But there's a more rigorous, in fact, study in philosophy. And that means that the subdisciplines in philosophy require specific studies. So, for example, if you're a medical doctor and you for example, discover the cure for cancer, would that qualify you as a philosopher? Not really. So a philosopher, okay, is someone who's doing philosophy, and in a certain way, philosophy is supposed to talk about the most fundamental questions in human existence. Okay? The most fundamental question, something that is more fundamental than, say, what doctors do, or what accountants do, or what lawyers do. But when they start to talk about something so basic, then they start to philosophize, right? For example, I'll give you an example. We talk about lockdowns. We talk about this crisis. We talk about the pandemic, etc., etc. So one side would say we have to be strict with the lockdowns, okay, so that we can control the spread of the virus. Another side would say, perhaps, this is with a perhaps, we have to loosen the lockdowns because we have to think of the economic activity. If we are too strict with the lockdowns, what will people eat? Okay, where will they get their food, etc., etc. So these are two perspectives talking about how to manage the pandemic, but a more philosophical way of looking at it, if you want to look at a more fundamental question there, is we can ask the question, what really is the importance of human life? Because both of them are assuming a certain interest. One is for economic activity, the other one is to manage death, okay, is to manage, is to control the spread, etc., etc. They're coming from those registers, but something more fundamental, and this is when they start to think about this, when they start to talk about this, then they're starting to philosophize. When they start to ask the question, what really is the value of human life? For example, I'll give you another example. When we start to make restrictions regarding how to mourn the dead, okay? Diba? During the lockdowns, there have been restrictions regarding burying our dead. Sometimes the dead are not even buried, they're immediately cremated. This kind of control, this kind of restriction, I'm not saying I'm for it or against it, I'm just giving you an example, that the immediate thinking here is that this is for everybody else. But is this worth it? Is it worth is it worth it to create a policy or to create restrictions that would go to our deepest, or that can go against our deepest beliefs, our deepest traditions, as being humans, as human beings. Human beings, after all, we mourn our dead. Animals don't mourn their dead. Now, even if that situation has been crossed, then what are we? Have we become barbarians? Right? Have we become, or how we mourn our dead, or the absence of mourning our dead? Do we still consider ourselves as human? Is it even a human thing to do for the sake of survival? So these are philosophical questions. I am not saying I'm against these restrictions. I'm not also saying I'm for these restrictions. I'm just saying that these are borderline situations when we start to think about it, we are actually starting to think philosophically.
So if and when let's say a talk show host, or perhaps a podcaster, or maybe perhaps a religious leader starts getting into the fundamentals, meaning and all of that deep and fundamental stuff, do they begin becoming philosophers?
Well, they start to philosophize. Yeah, clearly. But we are all, in the most general sense, we are all philosophers in the sense that we all ask these philosophical questions. You don't need to be tenured in a university and teach philosophy to be called a philosopher. In a general sense, we are all philosophers when we start to ask these questions. And clearly, we all ask these questions. That's why I said these are fundamental questions, because whether you are educated or not, right? Whether you come from wherever, from the farthest place in the globe, if you exercise your reason, it will eventually lead you to ask questions such as, is there an afterlife? Is there freedom? Is there a God? So
why are we suffering?
Why are we suffering? Okay. In fact, that was one of the main questions of Siddhartha Gautama, right? The Buddha. Yeah. It's a question of suffering. Okay. So these are philosophical questions. So, but the thing is, human as we are, and partly animal as we are, we do not want to pursue those questions because they don't put food on the table, right? So, for example, I want to pursue, if I'm a senior high student, I want to pursue philosophy because I'm interested. One of the main questions would be, how will you feed yourself? Diba? That's oftentimes the question that parents would ask, the background of a certain household. We want you to be this, we want you to be that, because apparently the term philosophy is not equated to success. Right? So, and that's not only in philosophy, that's also true, for example, among the artists, okay? Based on my experience. So there seems to be that equation. And that's why I think if I remember it right, I think this was a question that you asked in our last podcast. Why is the term philosopher taken in a negative way? I think it has something to do with our culture. A kind of anti-intellectual culture. That's why people would say, "Nosebleed mo na." What does that mean? it seems to shame the person trying to.
Smart shaming, right?
Oh, I think that's what they call it now, right?
Mm.
So something like that. So, and that the term philosopher, okay, in our culture seems to get a quite negative meaning. Okay? So I think that's one of the points.
Daryl, I must have been imagining it incorrectly. So please correct me if I'm wrong, because I was thinking back in the day, maybe like hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and maybe during a time of modernity, I was envisioning that many kingdoms, many kings, many great world leaders had a lot of philosophers around them, that these were the smart ones of society, that these were the people that they listened to mostly, the philosophers. Is that a correct assessment of how philosophers were treated back then? They were like one of the biggest advisors to the kings.
That's right.
And all that stuff. Is that a correct description of what it was, Daryl?
Yeah, sure. In ancient times, they were important advisors to kings. Even yeah, they were important advisors. I'm trying to remember some philosophers, but I'm not quite. Plato, I think. I'm not quite sure. Plato, I think, was an advisor to a certain king in Crete. I'm not sure anymore. Elizabeth I, for example, has philosophers in her court. Okay. Francis Bacon was a retainer in the court of Elizabeth I. So yeah, so there are philosophers in the courts among as retainers of kings and queens in the past.
So I'm curious. So when did philosophers, when did the prominence of philosophers begin to lessen, if you will? Because I would imagine that in the modern age, meaning to say today, not the modern age as you know it as in philosophy, I would imagine that there are still a lot of things that are outside of the realm of science, outside of the realm of all of these sciences. And it's best that we talk to a philosopher to help us figure things out. There's just so much out there that is still confusing and still beyond our comprehension. And a philosopher would probably be able to put it into words. Even today, when do you think people started listening less to philosophers, and who did they listen to more at the expense of the philosophers? I'm curious if there was a moment in history that happened.
Right. The politicians and the entertainers, they're always famous. They've always been famous. The philosophers are not famous to the public. They're not quite. They're prominent in the sense that perhaps their advices were taken by leaders, etc., etc. But they themselves were not prominent to the public. In fact, remember in the history of philosophy, Socrates was condemned, was executed by a court in Athens. He was executed via poison, okay, by the use of poison. So philosophers are not quite prominent in terms of
popularity.
In terms of popularity, yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
They're nowhere close to politicians or to entertainers, because you have to remember that for the politicians, okay, particularly in so-called democratic governments, they're where they get their energy, where they get their legitimacy is the public. That's why you have the term publicity. Okay, that's why you have popularity surveys, etc., etc. Entertainers too, because who are they entertaining if not the public? philosophers are quite different. In fact, philosophers are not quite into, they're not, I think, I'm generalizing, but there is a tendency for philosophers not to pander to the public, not to, you know, they call it whatever they have in mind after some thinking, etc., etc., regardless of what the public say or whether they like it or not. A philosopher say what is in his mind, something like that. That's not quite true among politicians, right? I'm not saying it. That's wrong. I'm not saying that politicians are, well, that lying is a part of your trade. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that they have to be quite circumspect in terms of what they do and what they say, because that's where they get their legitimacy as politicians. That's where they get their energy, so to speak.
So the philosophers, in a way, were exclusively for the elite. Is that what you're suggesting?
Some would say that's the case, but I also wouldn't. But I wouldn't agree to that position. It's only that, as I've said, everybody is capable of philosophizing because everybody asks these fundamental questions, but not everybody pursues these questions. Precisely with what I said earlier, it may seem that philosophy is for the elite because they would think that philosophy is a luxury, something that you do when you are not, something that you do in your spare time. But that's not the case, okay? Because even if you are working in an 8-hour shift, for example, in an office, there will always be a time where you are, when you ask those fundamental questions again, right? I have an example, although he's not quite connected, or is not considered as a philosopher in the big sense, but more of a man of letters. Franz Kafka, you have heard of him? He wrote a lot of works. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he worked as a clerk, and yet he gave the world so many important works. For example, the Metamorphoses, the novel. Okay? And it makes us think. His works makes us think about the human conditions, particularly in the context of modernity. By modernity, meaning the modernity of the 20th century, the bureaucracy. When you work for 8 hours, all that you do is to stamp on a document, and you do that for the next 8 hours. So it makes us think about those things. It makes us think about our humanity. It makes us think that perhaps we're merely just a cog in the machine. So here's an example of someone who is able to do, or who is able to give the world his works. Okay? A very important thinker, writer, and yet he is not working in the university. He's not someone who's teaching in a university. Okay, he is doing something else. Okay, so I wouldn't say that it's only for the elites. Okay, because everybody's able to philosophize. Everybody's able to think of those fundamental questions. It's just a matter of whether you pursue those questions or not.
Pursuing.
So I don't. Yeah. I don't agree to the position that philosophy is a luxury, that it's an extra time that you do. Okay? It's actually something very basic, very human. But I think it's the conditions that forces us no longer to think about those things, to pursue the human things, because we have to. We are pushed to work, even if it is no longer meaningful, right? So, yeah.
So do you think that the role of philosophy or philosophers for that matter, has been relegated in society these days, and they don't because they're caught in the day to day. They're rat in the rat race, in the wheel, that they have no more time to philosophize or maybe read up on the philosophers, because they're so busy doing living, surviving, and trying to get through today so they can make it tomorrow and have food on their tables, and all of those common problems that we all have.
Yeah, that's right. The term for that, I think, is oftentimes used is the banal things. The ordinary, the things that are so ordinary that we are no longer in touch with our humanity. We are no longer asking the question, why are we even doing this in the first place? That's why when I was teaching a few semesters ago, I tell my students this. So you come to university and you take up your courses, but have you ever asked yourselves why you want to be an accountant, why you want to be an engineer, why you want to do this or you want to do that? Besides the possible getting hired and the possible salary that you will get with that, have you ever thought if this is what you want? If, of course, in the end, we are all going to die. That's always the poignant part there. Because in philosophy, philosophy teaches us that in the end, we're all going to die. And within that horizon, as my teacher would say, within that horizon between birth and death, we are not quite sure where we came from because we were not conscious then. And we are not quite sure where we will go after death because we won't be conscious then too. Perhaps there's a God, there is no God, perhaps there's an afterlife or no. What we are conscious of is the in-between of birth and death. So between that, what are you going to do? And if you're not going to do anything, time's not going to stop for you. The world will still continue with or without you. And sometimes when you try to ponder on that question, it's sometimes quite late. When you're already in your deathbed, or when your doctor tells you you're terminal, so you have just very little time. So that's why death is quite an important. The notion of death is a very important. I don't know if you say notion, that should remind us that we are not going to last. We're going to decay. That we are, in the words of the poet Charles Baudelaire, we will become feast to worms someday. And so, what are we going to do? So that's a fundamental question. You don't need to have a PhD in philosophy. You don't even need to go to high school or to school to think about those things.
There are modern day problems that are given to, like, for example, this pandemic. It's usually the scientists, the doctors, these experts in their field that have been given this problem, and they're trying to solve this, right? They're trying to fix this. Of course, we came up with a vaccine in no time, and now we're in the vaccine stage and all that stuff. But if a philosopher were to try to solve this problem from a philosophical perspective, it would have come up with perhaps a totally and a different solution, right? Daryl, it would have been totally different. In the same way that you ask a philosopher to solve, let's say, the traffic problems of Cebu, for example, the solution would have been maybe perhaps different and maybe counterintuitive and perhaps even practical in a sense. What are your thoughts on applying philosophy in modern day problems, meaning to say now problems?
Right. That's the same question one of my students before, and this is what when I tell them: if you get sick, don't go to a philosopher. He won't know what to do. Okay. So a philosopher has his own niche, his or her niche in society, So if you get sick, you go to a doctor. You know, if a doctor or a scientist tells you that getting vaccinated is the best thing for, you know, it's going to offer us protection. Okay, and it's a scientific. It comes from the scientific community, the medical community, and if you're familiar with research, you know that they're generally following the rigors of research. Then you should listen to them, right? So that's what I'm trying to say. Don't ask a philosopher uh, to do your accounting. Okay.
No, wait a minute. If I'm sick, right? I'm sick. I talk to a doctor,
Right.
and the doctor tells me you're going to die in 3 weeks. I think
Right.
it's best that I talk to a philosopher at that point, right? Because you're going to have to face death, and you're going to have to try to make sense of what happened to you and your life, right? What am I going to do in my next, few months that I have left on this earth, right? For example, you're stuck in traffic, right? And traffic is bad, and you're busy, and you're late for something or whatever, and then you can't do anything about it. But if you maybe perhaps call a philosopher friend and try to make sense of, what am I here for anyway? Why am I in a rush? What am I in a hurry for, right? What am I late for? Like, it's all gonna, I'm just gonna die eventually. So why am I in a hurry to get out of this traffic jam? You know what I mean? So there are still philosophical questions that need to be answered, even if it's a medical or even a traffic problem.
Oh well, yes, right. That's not a question. Yeah, sure. So there are, because in every disciplines, there are situations, I would say extreme situations, fundamental situations or questions that requires philosophical clarifications.
Yeah.
Okay? And so that's an example. But when you talk about, for example, you're sick, you go to a doctor.
Of course,
Constructing a building, you go to an engineer. That's why, for example, in hospitals, they have an ethics review board. Okay?
Yeah.
And although many in the ethics review board are doctors, okay, the questions that are being asked are actually philosophical questions in terms of ethics.
So why aren't there philosophers in the board?
There are philosophers in the board.
Oh, really? Okay.
But sometimes by philosopher, I mean those who have a background in philosophy.
Okay.
Because those questions there are not only philosophical, they are also quite technical, that requires a background in medicine. Okay. So that's for example, I think one ethical question in vaccines, I don't know which vaccine that was, I forgot, was that, if I'm not mistaken, so there's a caveat here, one ethical question there is that one of the vaccine comes from the placenta, I'm not quite sure, of
women, from the womb, right?
It has something to do with abortion. Okay?
Yeah.
I can't quite make the connections. And so it became an ethical issue. So would it be ethical, particularly if you're Christian, if you're Catholic, if you use these vaccines and these vaccines come from aborted fetuses? That's just a general outlay. So that's an ethical question, right? That is a philosophical question. In medicine, again, one question is in terms of abortion. Abortion is actually a philosophical question. Of course, it's a theological question when we talk about it in terms of God, etc., etc. But it is a philosophical question precisely because it impinges on the question of when does human life begin? Because when you do an abortion, oftentimes the premise there is that you are killing human life, not just human life, innocent human life, and so it is murder. Okay? That's the premise there. But the philosophical question there is that organism, is that fetus, okay, a human life? When can we say that is a human being or not? When can we mark the beginning of human life? So that's a philosophical question. Okay? And that underpins, for example, an issue in medical ethics, biomedical ethics.
So maybe I'll ask you, from your philosophical perspective, sir, how you can make sense, for example, of let's say those that are against vaccination, those that feel that it is a right for them to have or not to have a vaccine, those that are pro-choice when it comes to their bodies, so they have the right to choose whether they have they inject the vaccine in themselves or not. Can you try to help make sense of that from a philosophical perspective, Daryl? Do you have a philosophical opinion about that matter?
I'll try. So, but this is coming from what I think, right?
Okay.
So, there are those who would insist that they have the right to their bodies, okay? So they don't want to be vaccinated. But we have to further qualify too if there are proper reasons, if it's reasonable, if their positions are reasonable. Perhaps there are it goes against his or her health, okay? As for example, provided by his or her doctor, right?
Children, for example, are not supposed to be vaccinated yet at a certain age.
Perhaps because the research has not matured yet. Okay, so that would be a reasonable position not to get vaccinated, right? But if, for example, you're a healthy, if you're not a child, for example, and there are no do you say contraindications against vaccination, then I think that you have a moral obligation to be vaccinated. Why? Because if the pandemic itself should have already taught us that we are interconnected. If we were just living in an island, okay, then that's fine. But we are not. So you might not want it, but your presence is always a potential vector to kill someone. So if you isolate yourself in an island, okay, then perhaps that would be a more reasonable, that might be a reasonable position to not get vaccinated. Okay? But if you are living in society and you see there's a surge, you don't need a surge. There's a pandemic. People are dying. Okay, and the transmission, okay, the
You're cutting out.
Particularly, for example, the Delta strain, the health professionals have obligation to attend to you when you're sick. And if you don't get vaccinated, you're adding to the burden. That's my position. Okay? And that's why there are different reasons for not getting vaccinated. Some out of fear, but we know that's not reasonable. Some out of some conspiracy theory, that's not quite reasonable. People would say you should not get vaccinated because it's a grand conspiracy. The government is whatever.
Trying to insert a microchip.
Yeah, inserting a microchip, and yet they are using cell phones, they're using Facebooks and Twitters. Okay, that's big data. Okay, so those are conspiracy theories. They are not reasonable. So if there's a reasonable position not to get vaccinated, it's very, I don't know. The list is very short. So if you ask me, we have a moral obligation to get vaccinated. Okay. Because we are endangering other persons. Okay? We affect other persons.
Sir, based on your huge knowledge of philosophy, I don't know if you can identify a specific philosopher, maybe during the Spanish flu back in 1918. Maybe, maybe not. But my question should be, who do you think who do you go to? Who do you think the world should try to read for philosophy, for prolonged suffering? You know, like in times of, let's say, in terms of war, for example, you know, those two world wars took a toll on the world, and the suffering was prolonged. The 1918 pandemic was also a few years long, and this pandemic, it looks like it's going to be a few more years long. So who do you think should they summon for some great philosophical advice for prolonged suffering? Maybe you can also give us your own personal philosophy on how to deal with prolonged global suffering like this pandemic.
Right. Not quite sure who, because, you know, a lot of philosophers are, it depends on, first of all, if you're just reading the philosopher for insights, there are a lot of philosophers. Some are poignant, some are, you know, apocalyptic, some are refreshing. So there's diversity. But perhaps the more famous thinker, philosopher, even psychologists recommend would be Viktor Franco. Okay?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you've heard of him, right? He was a survivor.
Man's Search for Meaning?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
He was a survivor in Auschwitz, if I'm not mistaken, in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And if you want to talk about, you know, if you want to find an inspiration, resilience, hope in this situation, okay, then Viktor Frankl definitely would be a good read, okay, if you ask me. And he is accessible to the public, okay, you know, there's less jargon, there's less, you don't need a background to read him. So I think Viktor Frankl is a good read. But I like to, my taste of readings are the poignant ones, sometimes the strange ones. So, and I don't think this might be, I love Kafka, for example. I like his works. There's another work by Albert Camus, The Plague. It also deals with the pandemic. Okay, so those might be good reads. Okay, if you ask me.
So The Plague by Kafka, Man's Search for Meaning by
Albert Camus.
Maybe you can message me the names of the books and the titles so we can post them when we post this video, sir.
Yeah, sure.
In times of crises like these, it'll do them a lot of good if they try to read those books that you mentioned, and we'll post eventually later on.
Yeah.
Do we have? I think I asked you this question before. First of all, before I get to that, Viktor Frankl only had one book, right? Was he like an author, or that was just that one book that he wrote?
No, he did. He has a lot of works, particularly following his what he calls as logotherapy.
Okay.
Different works. I'm not very much familiar with Franco.
But this was after his experience in the Holocaust, right? He didn't write anything before that. Is that correct?
As far as I know, yes. That was after the Holocaust.
So it was that earth-shattering moment in his life that he became some kind of philosopher, right? But he's not a philosopher by definition, right? Although we all are, but he's not a philosopher, or is he?
Well, if in that strict sense, he's still read he's still in the syllabus of many philosophy courses.
Oh, okay. So I guess
in that sense, yes, he's a required reading to a good required reading in existentialism, for example. Right. Even in psychology classes.
You know, like I said earlier, sir, there are a lot of great composers, writers out there, singers, bands that seem to go philosophical And they do
Yeah,
that
sure.
consistently. You know, when you read their words, when you read the lyrics of their songs, they are philosophical, and they ask the basic questions and delve about big questions about existence and meaning and when to stop and when what progress is and all that stuff. Um, I don't know if I mentioned this in our previous interview, but is it correct to say that in a way they are modern day philosophers? These artists, these singers, these people that talk about the big questions, the fundamental, and discuss the fundamental questions in their songs. In a way,
Yeah.
they be considered modern day philosophers, and can they also be taught in school?
Okay. My answer to that would be, and I'm coming from a more academic background this time, that unless they pursue that, unless they pursue their thinking, that means they write it down, okay, or they publish their works, and that it creates it creates a kind of influence. That means uh, people are starting to read him, study him, write about him. Then only then I think would he or she be considered as a philosopher or a thinker. Okay, so you have to go through and you have to be accepted by those in the field. Okay, so it's not just enough to say something philosophical, because all of us can do that. Okay, you can write a blog about it. You can whatever. But to be a philosopher, I think in the sense of what you're referring to, requires that he has to provide something original and original, but at the same time in continuity to the past thinkers. And that originality has to be bequeathed as a legacy. That means he has to write it down, he has to talk about it, and that also people will talk about his work, write about his work, comment about his work. Then he becomes, a required until he becomes a required reading in the syllabus. Okay. Otherwise,
Maybe you're correct
I
in
think
saying that they probably have to die first, right?
yeah, well, yeah. Some philosophers, when the important ones, I think, okay, either. So, let me put it this way. I think it was Nietzsche, I'm not quite sure, who said something that philosophers are either famous when they are dead, or they are famous even when they're alive. So there are philosophers who are already famous when they're still alive. But there are philosophers who only become famous and become recognized only after their death. For example, I think many of you are familiar with this. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, was not famous during his time. He was not recognized as a thinker during his time. He was only recognized 50 years after his death. So,
Oh.
You have to die, and then people write about you. Okay? Otherwise, there was, and this is what Harold Bloom, the Americanist, would say. History is replete with dustbins of works. Okay, that means that there are many works written now. Okay, fashionable, trendy, people read them. But in the near future, the only the sociologists or the historians would be interested in, reading those works, because it no longer stands. Okay, it's no longer, it does not make up what is they don't make up what it's called a classic. Okay. So I'm sure, for example, say what's an important work before, like Shakespeare. During the time of Shakespeare, I'm sure there are many who wrote, but we don't hear of them now. We hear of Shakespeare, but not of his contemporaries who wrote. They are already in the dustbins of history. Okay, and you can look at the books now, the novels now. Okay, and they might be trendy now, but let's see in the next 20 years. okay, if anybody still remembers them. Okay? So it's like that. People write. There's no question, but not everyone ends up important.
With this crisis now, sir, there's you see a lot of people who are depressed. There's so much. The suicide rates have skyrocketed. So this looks like a world that needs a little philosophy, right? Although not all philosophy is positive, right? There are also nihilists. There are also, negative philosophers out there, right?
Right.
So I think it's crucial that they read the right philosophers.
Yes.
Especially those that have existential questions, like whether to take their lives or not, or to be depressed, who are depressed and all that stuff. I think they need some encouragement from the dead, right? From the philosophers.
Yeah. So that's what I said earlier, Jig. That there are, if you're just reading, you have to be careful what you read. Okay. You have to remember that a library is not a library if it has no books that will scandalize you. So there will always be ideas that will scandalize you. And sometimes there are times that you might not be able to take it. And so that's the same with music. It's the same with poetry. Okay? Some music are quite poignant. Some music are, makes you lively, makes you live your life. But there are also some music that will, remind you of past hurts. Okay, so it's the same with works in philosophy. Okay, not in the same way as music. It's the same way in philosophy in such a way that there are, I think you mentioned nihilism. There are philosophers that are quite nihilistic in their values. Okay, and oftentimes they are not. Some would not prescribe them to be read. For example, in seminaries decades ago, I don't know if they still do that. There are works by philosophers that are not allowed to be read because it scandalizes their faith.
Wow. So, Daryl, sir, we are definitely in times of crises right now. We have been on this pandemic for more than a year and a half now, almost 2 years now, and there's still no end in sight. People are still, a lot of people are still suffering. There's so much death around us, so much sickness, and of course, along with it, the economic problems that we are all experiencing, especially the poorest of the poor, and all that. Maybe you can give us some kind words to help us get through this crisis, sir.
Right. I'm not quite sure if this was taken from the Italian philosopher. One of the thinkers that I constantly have been reading for the last decade is Giorgio Agamben. He's an Italian philosopher. He's still alive, but he's also quite notorious for his recent pronouncement regarding the COVID pandemic. But what I want to take from him is the idea, or is the line that thought is that courage. Okay, thought requires courage, particularly in our hopeless situation. Okay, because if you allow yourself to think, okay, to be thoughtful, okay, and it requires courage when you are down, when you are, when you're feeling depressed. Okay, it takes courage to think of possibilities, to think of a tomorrow. Okay, sometimes. And even if we are not, it takes courage to think, okay? And that's what I guess I want to emphasize. Thought is not merely just thinking, it's not just computing how much you owe someone on Tuesday, okay? Thought is not just writing a research paper. Okay? Thought is not just trying to find the medicine for COVID. Okay? Thought is also to, is also to understand your current situation, okay? To understand your possibilities and to understand your relation to others. Okay? That's why you say thoughtfulness is not just about thinking this abstract thing. Thoughtfulness is also to care for yourself and to care for the others. That's why when you care for someone, you say, oh, you're quite thoughtful. Okay. I'd like to emphasize that. Okay. Thoughtfulness is not merely just thinking, although it's important to think in those terms, this technical sense, but it's also, thoughtfulness also means to think in terms of our current situation, to think about our possibilities, okay? To think about our humanity. And to do that means that you care for your life, you care for your existence, and you care for the other. That's why going back to the vaccine, and I'd like to emphasize that if you are thoughtful, then you should care not only for yourself, but for the other. And to do that requires that you have to do your share, get vaccinated.
Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it at that. That was such a beautiful, inspirational lines that you gave us. Thank you so much. The co-professor of Department of Philosophy in the USC, Daryl Mendoza. Daghang salamat, sir.
Thank you, Jiggy.
And if they'd like to get in touch with you and read your mind and see your posts and get some dose of philosophy, perhaps, and ask you about a few things about philosophy, where can they catch you? Can they catch you on your personal page and all that? Is there anything that you can announce here on this podcast?
Well, I don't have a personal page.
Okay.
Maybe a Facebook account, but
okay.
If you want to join us in the philosophy department, okay, you can always check out our Facebook page. USC Department of Philosophy, USC, or you can visit our website www.usc.edu.ph, and you can find the Department of Philosophy. And if you want, you can join us. Maybe you guys want to do your graduate work with us. Maybe you come from a different field and you want to do work in philosophy. Perhaps you can join us in doing a master's in philosophy, or if you are still thinking of doing an undergrad, you can join us in our bachelor in philosophy program.
From what I understand, you're taking up you're trying to finish your PhD in philosophy. Am I correct?
Right.
So what is it about philosophy that you love so much that you are spending another few years of your life trying to study it and get a PhD? What is it about philosophy?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if this was, I said this earlier, but it's about liberation, Philosophy is liberating. And that, whenever you talk about liberation, whenever you talk about freedom, you can never take away thinking. To think is to be free. That's why, as I've said, if you only look at the totalitarian societies or near totalitarian societies or dictatorial societies, they don't want you to think. They want to curtail your freedom, and they do that by not letting you think. They want to take away education. They want to censor the free press, okay? Because they don't want you to think. They want to imprison you, okay? So thinking is connected with freedom. In fact, freedom is thinking, and thinking is freedom. If you think, then you're free. You feel liberated. And that's what philosophy, I think, offers. Okay? You might not be free from the problems in the world, but you are conscious that you have choices, that you have possibilities. And that despite that, okay, I would like to think that it gives you a certain kind of profound joy. And that's philosophy, okay? Not there for, my dentist would say, why did you take up philosophy? I like it, but it doesn't pay the bills, doc. It doesn't pay the bills.
And let's just hope that our countrymen, sir, will also try to think. They don't have to study philosophy, like you said, but hopefully they will. But they don't have to, and they can always think and free themselves from what Marley would describe as mental slavery, right? And hopefully we'll free ourselves from all of that by just getting a little philosophical about life's big questions. Daryl, thank you so much, sir. It was amazing talking to you.
Jiggy. I'm
always a new person every time I talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jiggy, for inviting me. Okay.
Thank you all.
Hassle-free on-demand delivery that starts at 15 pesos only. Look no further than Lala Move. Download the app now. Lala Move now delivers to Caracal, San Fernando, Naga, Danao, and Compostela. Download Lala Move now.